Hello, my name is Dr Ken Amor and I work at St John's College, Oxford University. In this talk, I'm going to be discussing the prospect for discovering life on Mars. There's been a global interest in Mars exploration from organizations such as NASA, the European Space Agency, and this year in 2021, the Chinese National Space Agency as well, along with several other countries. So one of the reasons for this is that one of the big questions of our time is, are we alone in the universe? Does life exist elsewhere? Or is it just on Earth by some fluke or chance that is Earth the only place in the universe where we find life? That's a really big question which many scientists and organizations are trying to answer. One way of estimating the probability of finding intelligent life in the universe was something that a scientist called Frank Drake thought about in 1961. And he put together this equation, which now bears his name, consisting of 7 parameters. And it tries just to estimate a probability of finding life, intelligent life, in the universe. Unfortunately, for nearly all of these variables, we don't have very good numbers on it. Most scientists now have to essentially make an educated guess for a lot of these variables. But one parameter that we can perhaps get a more definitive a number for is this parameter here, which is the fraction of suitable planets on which life actually appears. At the moment, obviously, we only know of one planet in our own solar system where we have life. But if we could find evidence for life, or even where life perhaps once existed on another planet, or perhaps even a moon, one of the larger moons surrounding either Jupiter or Saturn, then that would greatly increase the probability of finding intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. So why go to Mars? Well, Mars is the most Earth-like planet in our solar system. So it's quite smaller than the Earth. It's in this picture on the right-hand side. It's the planet on the far right. But nevertheless, space probes and the rovers such as this Mars Perseverance rover, which landed on Mars in February 2021, send back pictures that look remarkably Earth-like. So this is why this is why we go to Mars, because it is perhaps the most Earth-like planet in our solar system. A lot of the rocks and minerals are recognizable. Many of the landscapes are recognizable as the sort of landscapes that we can find here on Earth. Perhaps more importantly, there is really strong evidence for the existence of liquid water on the surface of Mars, at least in the past. And in this picture, which looks down on Jezero crater, where the Mars Perseverance rover landed, over on the left, you can see quite a wide, sinuous channel that's been cut or eroded into the surface of Mars. And in the center, there's this sort of fan or delta-like structure, which looks remarkably like the sort of sediments left behind or left beneath a river delta that we find here on Earth. And so this increases the prospect that the conditions were once right for life to have started on Mars, because we believe that water is an essential medium for some of the biological or biochemical reactions that are required for life. And just looking at the landscapes, as I've said before, it looks remarkably Earth-like. This is a photograph of Mars from Gale Crater, where the Curiosity rover is, and it looks a familiar landscape, at least for some of the more sort of drier desert type conditions that we find here on Earth. So one of the primary aims of the Perseverance mission is to look for the existence that life once existed on Mars. So what are conditions like now? What's the environment of Mars in the present day? Well, first impressions are that it's really inhospitable. It can best be described as a cold, dry desert. And by cold, average temperatures are about -60 degrees centigrade, but can vary from -140 degrees centigrade up to a maximum of about 30 degrees centigrade in the equator during summer. The atmosphere is very thin. It only has an atmospheric pressure of about 600 pascals, as compared to Earth's atmospheric pressure, which is over 100,000 pascals. And the composition of the atmosphere is primarily made up of carbon dioxide, with a little bit of nitrogen, argon, and a few other traces of other gases. There's also some evidence that water ice exists, particularly in the polar regions. There's a water ice cap in one of the poles. And there's also evidence that water ice exists just below the surface in the high latitudes. But unfortunately, no liquid water can survive for very long on the surface of Mars at the present time because of this very low atmospheric pressure. Nevertheless, in this photograph, particularly the rock formations in the foreground, consist of finely laminated rocks that on Earth we would interpret as being transported sediment and deposited in a large standing body of water, such as a lake. And it's evidence like this that strongly suggests that at some time in the Martian past, liquid water was present in quite large abundances on the surface. So how long ago was that? Well, we might have to go back about 4 billion years. But if we did, what were conditions like 4 billion years ago? And Mars would be a very different place. It would be warm, wet environment with a much thicker atmosphere, capable of supporting liquid water, large bodies of standing water, particularly in these sort of large craters, which are scattered across the surface of Mars. There's strong evidence that water once flowed, and indeed it's now suggested that Mars at one time had a full hydrological cycle of evaporation, cloud formation, rain or snow, running water on the surface, eroding just like water erodes on the surface of the Earth, carving out river channels and transporting and depositing sediment. And it's even been suggested that 4 billion years ago, Mars had enough water in order to be able to support quite a large ocean. So this is a little video animation that's been put together, which just kind of illustrates some of the environmental conditions that existed 4 billion years ago. However, at some point, at about between 4 and 3 billion years ago, the environment on Mars changed. And it's thought it changed because Mars lost its magnetic field. And over time, very slowly, the solar wind stripped away most of the Martian atmosphere, leaving what is now a very dry, cold, and desert-like environment. However, that change would have taken quite a long time, long enough for any life that did start to be able perhaps to adapt to these, what we would now consider to be very inhospitable conditions. So in order to understand the prospect of whether life ever got going on Mars, perhaps we need to reflect upon how and when life began on Earth. Charles Darwin speculated that life began in a warm little pond with just the right conditions, the right sort of chemicals, and somehow life emerged. This is still a very big area of scientific research and debate. And the answer to the question, how and when did life begin on Earth, we don't actually know the answer to that question yet. But scientists are beginning to research and look at ideas about how life might have started here on Earth, and then hence perhaps might have started elsewhere in our solar system. The earliest known fossil is about 3.2 billion years old, and it looks very much like this rather lumpy rock formation, which you can still find in the present day. These are actually formed by colonies of single-celled microbes that have a very sticky mucus outer covering to the cells, and they trap sediment, so they trap sand and silt grains, and they actually build up a kind of rock-like structure. But it's very much a biologically mediated process. It takes a very long time. If you cut one of these structures open, it looks very much like this. You can see the very thin layers of sediment, and as different sediment comes in, is washed in over these sort of colonies and structures, it traps this sediment, and they form these quite sort of delicate, intricate structures. In the fossil version, of course, the organic matter has long since disappeared, but this is still regarded as a fossil because it had a biological origin. Interesting to note that these microbes are photosynthetic. Life must have began much earlier than that, because these are quite relatively sophisticated microbes that are able to live in colonies. But the first earliest known life must have been single-celled, unicellular, living on its own in isolation. And the other interesting point to note as well is that life would have started here on Earth in the absence of free oxygen in the atmosphere. And so the first life on Earth would have been anaerobic. Oxygen only really rose to the present atmospheric levels of about 20%, about 550 million years ago, with the first traces of oxygen in the atmosphere about 2.5 billion years ago. But this earliest known fossil of 3.2 billion years is much earlier than that date. And the first living matter, first living cells would have been even earlier. There is some suggestion of an earlier fossil dated at about 3.7 billion years old, but that still has yet to be confirmed. So what are the first steps for forming the first biological cells? Well, one of the first things you need is organic compounds. And by organic compounds, I mean molecules composed primarily of carbon and hydrogen, but also with a little bit of oxygen or nitrogen and perhaps a little bit of sulfur. And there are many thousands of known organic compounds. But perhaps one of the first sources of organic compounds here on Earth was brought to us on comets. So we think that there was a bombardment of cometary material from about 4 billion years ago, which perhaps might have seeded the Earth with quite important organic compounds such as amino acids, which have been found in certain types of primitive meteorites, which are thought to be representative of what cometary material might also be made of. Another exciting prospect is that some of these organic compounds were actually synthesized in our own atmosphere. And there's a famous 1950s experiment called the Miller-Urey experiment, where they within a sealed experimental apparatus, they put together gases which were thought to exist in the early atmosphere of Earth, such as methane, nitrogen, hydrogen, water vapor, and ammonia. And they subjected these gases to an electric spark to simulate lightning. And they ran this experiment for about a week. And what they found was that you could synthesize a couple of amino acids. So you could actually create some of the building blocks for life within our own atmosphere. As we've begun to explore the really deep oceans, what we found is that there are these submarine hot springs, sometimes called black smokers. These are very metal rich, and they also contain gases such as carbon dioxide and methane, and they operate at fairly high temperatures. And in today's biochemical experiments, it's found that metals can catalyze a lot of organic reactions to synthesize new compounds. And so again, it's been speculated that another way to build up a collection of different organic compounds and materials is actually through some of these submarine hot springs. So it would appear that there are many avenues for building up a collection of organic compounds. So the next thing that scientists have started to look at is what were the first components. Modern day cells are very complex pieces of biochemistry. And basically there are three possible options that people are currently working on and researching. The first one of these is the RNA molecule, which consists of a series of amino acids joined together. RNA molecules are thought to be the precursor of DNA, and they can be used to build other amino acids and proteins, and consequently are important, certainly in today's cells, but it would have been quite an important first step for an RNA molecule to be synthesized very early on. There's a kind of difficulty here, though, because so far as we know, at least certainly in nature, the RNA molecule cannot replicate itself. And one of the kind of primary activities, or one way of defining life, is its ability to reproduce itself. So then people also looked at that for all these biochemical reactions, what you also need is a metabolic cycle. And here's an example of a very important metabolic cycle in present day life. So this is the citric acid or Krebs cycle, which is used to derive energy or to provide energy that all life needs. As you can see, it's actually quite complicated. There's lots of different organic compounds are required lots of different steps. And so people have looked at how you might, or how and indeed where you might start to get this, these sort of metabolic cycles might start to operate. And here perhaps we go back to Darwin's small warm pond, where you had quite a what's often referred to as a soup of different organic compounds all mixed together and reacting in certain ways. Again, it's been speculated that perhaps the earliest metabolic cycles relied upon metal catalysts. So very much as biochemists working in a lab today rely on metal catalysts in order to synthesize new compounds. So perhaps that was the way that the first metabolic cycles began. And then the third component that people have speculated that you would require would be some sort of cell-like compartment where all these reactions can take place. So it's all very well to have a chemical soup in a small warm pond, but for life as we would regard it today, you really need to start having a cell-like structure where all these reactions can take place. And one way you can do that is by having a very simple lipid or fat type compound, which in an aqueous environment will form globules. So a lot of lipid molecules or fats will readily form these sort of globules if you sort of add them to water. So this sort of very sort of simple lipid-like structure may very well have been the sort of compartment for the first cells. So quite a lot of the scientific debate and research has been going on as to which of these three steps actually came first. But I think people are beginning to arrive at the conclusion that perhaps they all actually happened at round about the same time. And again, it's kind of speculated, was that just a chance event? Or was it an inevitable process? So the structure of the first cells was probably very simple, as shown or illustrated on the left-hand side of this slide, with a sort of lipid or sort of fatty cell wall, a few strands of RNA, and some sort of metal catalyzed metabolic cycle in order to derive a form of energy. This is very different from a modern day eukaryote type cell, which has a cell nucleus, has DNA in the nucleus, has all sorts of other cell structures like ribosomes and mitochondria, and are really quite complex by comparison. So perhaps life began on Mars, but then went extinct. What evidence might we hope to find if life first arose about 4 billion years ago? Is there anything that might survive to the present day? Well, fortunately there is. Some of these organic compounds, particularly long chains of carbon atoms or carbon atoms in a ring type structure, as illustrated here, are known to survive for very long periods of time in rocks here on Earth. And so the prospect of finding organic compounds in some of the Martian rocks, particularly the sedimentary rocks, it would be quite high. And actually, early indications are that organic compounds have been found and do exist in Martian rocks. That said, organic compounds can be synthesized by inorganic or non-biological reactions. So it's not yet confirmation of life. Ideally, we'd need to get samples returned to labs and research centers here on Earth in order to determine what types of organic compounds are preserved in Martian rocks. Isotope anomalies are another way that we might be able to find evidence for life on Mars. The carbon atom has three isotopes, carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14, where the numbers refer to the mass of the nucleus of the atom. And it simply is caused by a different number of neutrons in the nucleus of an atom. Carbon-14 is radioactive with a half-life of about 5,000 years, so we can rule that out. But carbon-12 and carbon-13 are really quite stable. And what we know about life on Earth is that it favors very slightly carbon-12 atoms. And so as compared to the overall abundance of carbon here on the Earth, biological life has a very small, but something that can be measured on a mass spectrometer, but has a very small preference for carbon-12. And this is a product of kinetics of some of the biochemical reactions that go on. And so being able to return samples here on Earth and measure any isotope anomalies or the isotopic composition of these organic compounds would again be another step in determining whether life ever existed on Mars. And then there's also the prospect of the rovers finding fossil structures. Ideally, many scientists would like to find fossil structures like these, but these here on Earth, these types of fossil structures, which we call stromatolites, were produced by photosynthetic microbes. And it's uncertain, again, whether that evolutionary step to develop photosynthesis was just a chance event or whether it's an inevitable process of evolution. But nevertheless, finding something like this on the Martian surface would be, I think most people would regard as definitive proof. And then there's also the rather enigmatic methane emissions which have been detected in the atmosphere of Mars. So methane here on Earth can be generated by biological means. So there are some types of microbes which emit methane, but methane can also be produced by inorganic reactions. Nevertheless, there have been some intriguing measurements over the last few years, and the detection of methane in variable quantities with time of methane in the Martian atmosphere. And at the present time, we don't know what that source is. But being able to determine what the source of the methane emissions, again, it might be evidence that life currently exists somewhere on Mars, probably beneath the surface. So here's a video from NASA about what they're looking for and what they hope to find.
We want to know, has life ever existed on Mars? Do pockets of life persist on Mars today? NASA's approach to answering these questions is to break them down into smaller and smaller steps. First, we need to know if ancient Mars was habitable. Did it once have the right climate and the right chemistry to support life? The Curiosity rover is investigating these questions by looking for organic molecules containing carbon. Organic molecules are the backbone of all life on Earth, though they can also come from non-living sources. Today, the surface of Mars readily destroys organics, making them difficult to detect.
We are decelerating.
6 years ago, Curiosity landed in Gale Crater on an ancient lake bed. A few months after arrival, it drilled into sedimentary rocks and detected traces of organic molecules using an instrument called SAM. Now Curiosity is climbing the mound in the middle of Gale Crater, and SAM has made a subsequent detection of organics. This new detection is exciting because it comes from rocks that are billions of years old. That means that the organic material within them is extremely ancient. Some of the organics that Sam has detected contain sulfur, likely introduced through geological processes. Sulfur can act as a preservative, binding organic molecules together to make them tougher and protecting them from oxidation. In fact, sulfur is the element that makes hair and fingernails tough, as well as vulcanized rubber. Martian sulfur has probably had a similar effect on these old organic molecules, helping to preserve them over geological timescales. Sam made the new detections by heating samples of crushed rock to very high temperatures, above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This vaporized the samples and released several species of small hydrocarbons like benzene and propane. Because the hydrocarbons were released at such high temperatures, they may be the fragments of bigger, heavier molecules within the rock similar to kerogens. On Earth, kerogens are found in rocks like black shale and coal and are the products of ancient plant and bacteria. We don't know if the recently discovered organics on Mars are of biological origin, but it's exciting to find such old material preserved right at the surface. This finding is also encouraging for future exploration. NASA and the European Space Agency are preparing to send the next generation of rovers to Mars in 2020, carrying new technologies to search for signs of microbial life. In the distant past, Mars was much warmer and wetter than it is today. The rocks at Gale Crater tell us it was once an environment where life as we know it could have survived. The discovery of ancient organic molecules shows that another ingredient of life was present at that time, and it broadens our understanding of habitability of both ancient and modern Mars.
Okay, so we can always ask the question, if life still does exist, or if life started on Mars and it managed to adapt to a change in its environment, where might it exist today? Until about 30 years ago, we thought life on Earth was confined to really quite a narrow range of what we might describe as a habitable environment. But over the last 30 years, we found that life can both survive and indeed thrive in conditions that we humans would regard as inhospitable. So microbial life has been found at temperatures below freezing and above boiling point of water, deep underground in rock fractures, in the deepest parts of the oceans, in the Mariana Trench at greater than 10 kilometers below the surface of the water, in very alkaline and very acidic waters, such as these hot springs in Wyoming, in very salty water, up to 30% salt as compared to seawater, which is only 2.5%. And it can also survive ionizing and UV radiation. So there are different species which are adapted to each of these extreme environments. We call this sort of group of microbial life extremophiles. So taking a look at some of these conditions that life can actually survive in, and comparing that to what the environment is like on Mars today, it kind of broadens the possibility that life might have adapted to what we would regard as an inhospitable extreme environment. And the survival in extreme environments doesn't just, or isn't just limited to single-celled microbial life. There are some types of multicellular animals, and in particular, a group of animals called the tardigrades or water bears, which can survive in quite extreme environments. So these are normally found in damp, humid conditions. They're only about 1 millimeter in length, but they can survive extremely low and high pressures, very low and high temperatures, dehydration, radiation, and they've even been exposed to the vacuum of space and returned to Earth, still able to live and breed just as normal. They do this by going into a form of suspended animation. So they can only survive these conditions for a relatively limited time period. But nevertheless, they've adapted this strategy in order to be able to survive extreme environments. So where might we find life on Mars in the present day, if it exists? Probably deep underground, where it'll be a little bit warmer, where liquid water might exist deep underground in rock fractures. Would probably be quite simple microbial type of life. But nevertheless, that would be, or at least that would be my guess, for the best options for life on Mars at the present time. So when will we know the answer to some of these questions? Well, so there are several rovers trundling around Mars at the present time, Curiosity and Perseverance in particular, quite sophisticated mobile laboratories that are examining rocks. The answer could come tomorrow, or it might come in several years' time, or perhaps they might find no evidence for the existence of life. It's still very much an open question. But you can find out, or you can keep track of progress by just doing a web search on Mars 2020 or NASA Mars, just to keep up to date with what's going on at the present time. Thank you for listening.